Hello and welcome to The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute.
I'm Nique a member of the Leadership Network at AEI and an adjunct professor at Rice Business School and Washington University Orland Business School.
Nique, as always, great to see you as we move forward with our effort to highlight some amazing Black men whose work needs to be platformed even more. And we're so proud and honored to be joined today by Dr. Jason Hill. Dr. Hill, who will go by Jason for this conversation, is a professor of philosophy at DePaul University and author of multiple books, and we're going to talk about a few of them. And also, Jason and I have known each other for many years from our Jamaican connections, and also some of our work together with Bob Woodson at the Woodson Center. But Jason, great to see you.
Great to see you, Ian, and thank you for having me. And Nique, nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you, Jason. Thank you.
So you are a prolific author, a student and teacher of philosophy. You've written some amazing books, bestseller. We Have Overcome, which we want to talk to you about. What do white Americans owe Black people? And your upcoming book, Letters to God from a Former Atheist. I want to get into all of those, but it's always helpful for, I think, our listeners to get a sense of who you are. How is it that you've come to believe the things that you've come to believe? We share some Jamaican roots. So tell us a little bit about your past, where you're from, and how you've come to believe what you believe.
Well, thank you again. And so I was born in Jamaica and raised in Jamaica. I came to America when I was 20 years old because I basically thought that Jamaica was quite provincial and too parochial to contain my aspirations. And I had pinned my aspirational identity on accomplishing something quite remarkable. So I thought I should really come to America. My mother thought my brother and I were too young, so she accompanied us and to give us moral support. And so I came at 20 and went to Georgia State, where I did a degree, a double major in English literature and philosophy, and then went on to do my PhD in philosophy at Purdue University. And but was always in love, had always had a love affair with America from I was in Jamaica. For some reason, I had thought that this was a country that I really wanted to, as I said, pin my aspirational identity on, the country, which I thought would provide the milieu in which I could realize my greatest goals, and more importantly, the milieu in which I could achieve the kind of character, the moral character that was still in the making, that ensconced in this great republic of ours were all the ingredients that I could utilize to achieve moral ambition. I'm a very morally ambitious person. I'm an ethicist by training and a moral theorist. And I thought that America was a country where, to use your term, Ian, agency, my agency could find its highest aspirational reach.
Wow, you were a modern day Alexis de Tocqueville. So where did that come from? What was it when you were growing up in Jamaica that this vision of this country, how did that seep through to you? And then what gave you the courage to say, I'm actually going to leave my home and come to this country?
That's an interesting question because I come from a family of Marxists and communists. My grandfather was should have been the first prime minister, really, of Jamaica. When my father was born, he was in a detention center because the English government had detained him as one of the pioneers of the independence movement, and he formed the first trade union for back then what was called colored people. His mother was his father was a socialist. His wife was a socialist. All of my family are on the left. I was the only conservative. And to answer your question, I think it was my first lesson in American history in high school that gave me this sort of insatiable hunger. But I think going back to the emotional roots of where the crucibles in which this yearning and this aspiration were formed. My parents left Jamaica when I was about 3 years old and they migrated to the United States. And it should have been a 3-month separation. It turned into 4 years because my father developed schizophrenia and my mother didn't. None of us knew about it, and we saw them a couple of times a year. And my mother divorced him and came back to the States when I was 7. And so I had this longing for America because that's where my parents were during the formative years of my childhood, from I was 3 till I was 7. So there's always an emotional basis for, I think, an intellectual aspiration. So coupled with what I learned about America in high school when I went to Campion College, that my study of the Declaration of Independence, we learned about the Constitution. I had this idea that I could remake myself. I was never satisfied with who I was. There was always a sense that I was an artist and I could also not just create artworks, but I could restylize myself. I was never satisfied with the image that God created. I was going to restylize myself and remake myself in an image of my own design, and that America is a place where you could start metaphysically from scratch. Wow. It didn't really matter where you came from or your background or your origins. America really cared about your destiny, where you're going forward, where you're going to. And so I just thought that America was I was a patriot before I actually came here, because I thought America was really the country that gave you the opportunity to start from scratch and remake your life and redesign your life in an image that you forge in the crucibles of your imagination. And that's a great thing, because most countries are really based on lineage and caste. And America is the antipode to that.
And so was that the early inspiration for your first book, We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American People?
No, that was my fourth book. My first book was Becoming a Cosmopolitan, What It Means to Be a Human Being in the New Millennium. I wrote 3 books before I wrote We Have Overcome. My first book was Becoming a Cosmopolitan, and that was written out of a love for humanity, which I still have, which I can't explain. Cosmopolitanism is the idea that you're a citizen of the world, and that your first loyalty is to humanity, not to your racial or ethnic or national origins. And I still think that way. I mean, I don't disassociate myself with my Jamaican roots, but I'm a deep lover of humanity in the way that I cannot explain any more than I can explain my love for chocolate or a certain genre of music. I love humanity, and I love humans. I'm in love with the human species. I think God did a great job when he created man and humankind. And so I wrote these 3 books with a trilogy. The second one was called Beyond Blood Identities. And the third one was called When We Should Not Get Along, Civil Disobedience. And those 3 books are a trilogy that center around the notion of cosmopolitanism and why we should be citizens of the world while being patriots of our country. And then I wrote We Have Overcome, which was a response to that man who hates America called Ta-Nehisi Coates. I read his book, Between the World and Me, and I wrote an article in Commentary that went viral. And the wonderful editor at Bombardier Books, David Bernstein, wrote to me and said, we'd like you to write a book for us.
Yes, I definitely want to speak to you about that book and the response to Ta-Nehisi Coates, because it's a very different vision.
Ian, one thing, Jason, because I loved your intro salvo, Ian. Did America exceed your expectations when you arrived? And how do you rate America today in living up to that magnificent vision and representation you had of our country before you came here?
It exceeded my expectations. America has never, ever once disappointed me. That is, the idea of America has never disappointed me. I think that race relations have improved. I think that the idea of America continues to grow. I do think that we are in a declinist trajectory, and I'm not one of these apocalypticists who thinks that we are beyond repair. I think that our great republic can be salvaged, and I continue to think that America is the place in which my identity and my continued growth, my moral growth, and my spiritual growth is best suited for. I have taught at I've been at DePaul now for 24 years. I've been a professor for 27, and I've taught Ku Klux Klan kids in the cornfields of Southern Illinois, where 90% of my students were in the Klan. So I've taught at Columbia University as a guest professor. So I've seen, the let's say the poorest and the best, and it has never once altered my vision of America. I've never, it has never, nothing has ever tainted my appetite, my taste for this great republic. I've sometimes been disappointed in the sensibilities of our country. I think we've grown coarse and a little bit vulgar as a people. But the idea of America and what America stands for and the moral meaning of America still remains central to me and still is very much alive.
You've mentioned the word identity multiple times, and it's such a powerful concept. But to your point, it seems like in America we're moving away from America as an identity versus these subcategories of race or gender or other markers. It's kind of a reductionism that's happening. First of all, do you agree with that? And if so, why do you think it is so appealing to people to grab onto superficial characteristics like race or gender or any of these other markers of identity?
I think it's primarily a creation of the left because victimology and victimhood have paid off quite well. It's very, very un-American. But what you have within the left is a sort of managerial class that has built its identity on creating a plantation class of helpless victims who they have convinced have no agency, to use your wonderful term, have no capacity to use their creative capabilities to uplift themselves, and that the left and members of the left feel that their purpose in life really is to keep Black people downtrodden. And if Black people dare to aspire to uplifting themselves, they have really annihilated the identity of the left, because it goes something like this. If my purpose and my meaning in life is predicated on your eternal suffering, then in some sense, I need to see you suffer and remain a victim, or else you've annihilated the purpose of my existence. So I think we've had a left elitist bourgeois class of people who have convinced a lot of minorities, especially Blacks, that they are victims, that America is intrinsically racist and bigoted, that it's still structurally and institutionally a racist country, which I don't think it is anymore. It used to be at one time before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which I address in my book, about Do White Americans Owe Black People? And so I think some Blacks have tenaciously held on to a narrative because they have relitigated past grievances because it pays. There's a lot of money in it. And a left-wing agenda has convinced them that the polar opposite of that position leaves them somehow, as Shelby C. would say, bereft of any meaning. I mean, what do you do when official oppression, has ended? You just become a regular American.
Right.
You're nothing special. You're just ordinary. So you got to become like a drama queen or a drama king and create some sort of, chaos and create a new narrative of victimhood. And that's the real reason, I think, to answer your question, we have this sort of factionalism and identity, a politics of identity that is growing larger and larger. Because of an existential crisis that really has arisen since the post-1964 Civil Rights Act has been passed. And we no longer are an oppressed people.
I mean, what's always so fascinating to me is that the taste of self-achievement, the experience of victory and being able to attain your goals, for me, and that's what we try to help our students feel, the sense of agency that you can lead a self-determined life of meaning and purpose. there's such fulfillment there. It always strikes me as strange that that is not enough to overcome the allure of this constant victimhood, of this constant feeling of there's someone else that we're dependent on in order to be successful.
Right. Uh, I think there's a twofold response that I would give. That there is a level of narcissism that's involved. That is, um, if you somehow just rely on your own agency and you rely on your creative capabilities, there's nothing special. There's nothing unique or exceptional about you. You're just an ordinary American who doesn't really need the help of too many people. You rely on your own great tenacity, honor, and resilience. But there is a sort of insidious narcissism when you use your victimology and your victimhood as a way of inducing guilt and shame in white people, for example. Um, there's a kind of like you become a sort of there's a kind of iconicism that you adopt within your personhood because you're stamped with imprimatur of innocence when you become a victim, and there's something quite narcissistic about that. And I think people would rather trade in that kind of narcissism and innocence and than than just become ordinary Americans who are striving to use their agency and to use their capabilities to make something of their lives and not to seek any kind of exceptionalism in their personality or their character based on race or based on ethnicity.
Jason, take our audience through kind of what the book is about. What do white Americans owe black people?
Well, I took the reparations argument very seriously. As an ethicist, as a political theorist, I thought, it's when Gavin Newsom started to lead the initiative to push a reparations agenda in California, and when there were calls by various politicians to lead a reparations initiative, I said, as a philosopher, I've got to take this really seriously. So the book really is an attempt to address reparations and to show why it's both an untenable it's an untenable position ethically, and it's an untenable position logistically. I'm more interested in the book in laying out the untenability of it from an ethical standpoint. And so I start from the beginning. I show in the first chapter that the collusion between Africans and Arabs, vis-a-vis the transatlantic slave trade, that if we're going to talk about reparations, we should really be looking to Nigeria and Ghana to also bring about restitution to blacks, because they were colluding with Europeans in the first place. And more importantly, I also look at I spend a lot of time.
And growing wealth, by the way.
And growing wealth, exactly. And I look at the 1964 Civil Rights Act and its concomitant satellites like the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1972 Employment Act, and the what I call cultural reparations movement, which was the Black Studies, the diasporic Black Studies and Black Studies diasporic movements, which sprang up in the 60s. And I argue that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a great act, but it was also a moral eugenical moment in American history. It constituted a violation of property rights, but I argue a proper violation because given the collusion between whites and blacks in creating racists out of white people, the state had an agenda to make reparations. So I take the 64 Civil Rights Act as a reparative moment, a third founding in America. The second founding I take to be Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and the Civil War. And to show that the 64 Civil Rights Act was not just a reparative moment, it was a way of telling white people that you cannot use your private property as an extension of your living room. And it was a way of retraining the sensibilities of white people and saying, we're going to make non-racists out of you. If you think that you're going to use your private property just as an extension of your personal agency, and you're wrong. And that was a very eugenical moment in American history, coupled with affirmative action. My point is that unless we want to live in a very bloated totalitarian state, that's as far as a free society can go in terms of reparative moments for Americans. Now, reparations, I believe in terms of the following. If you can ostensibly point to damages that individual blacks have suffered, there have been cases in Mississippi and the South where families have been divested of their properties, for example, because of Jim Crow laws. Then it's proper, as Reagan did with the Japanese. He gave, I think, each surviving person who was interred $25,000. Then in those cases, if you can ostensibly show where there was theft or appropriation of land, inappropriate appropriation, well, all appropriation is appropriate, then I think that restitution and reparations. But this wholesale notion of attributing all disparities between or among races to slavery is empirically untenable. And the second aspect, or the second premise on which reparations is predicated, which is ancestral blame, is also empirically false, because the majority of whites who would be responsible for reparations actually came to the States after the Civil War. So on many, many grounds, it's unethical. And so the book really is a detailed examination of the ethical dimensions of what would be involved in reparations. And I sort of don't really get into the sort of logistical impossibility or the logistical difficulties, one should say, of reparations, but more the ethical dimensions that would be involved in reparations.
And so when Coates wrote his piece in The Atlantic, making the case for reparations, as you say, this idea just lit up like wildfire.
Yeah.
Was it tapping into sort of an inborn guilt amongst white people, saying, okay, regardless of the Civil Rights Act, regardless of these other things, the disparities still exist, and so therefore I think Shelby Steele writes about this all the time, this kind of poetic truth that we can now make these people that maybe I haven't wronged them, but my forebears, my ancestors did. Is that why does this idea keep having traction?
Because it's a form of virtue signaling. It's a shortcut to gaining a moral status. It's like, here's a moral analogy. It's like someone helping a poor little old lady put her suitcase up in the cabin in the airplane, and then taking a selfie of himself doing it, and then posting it on Instagram. It's a shortcut to achieving a moral identity. I'm an Aristotelian. Acquiring a moral identity is a long, protracted, lifelong achievement and process. And I think it's just far easier to virtue signal and say, yes, my ancestors owned slaves, or my grandfather was a racist, and I am for reparations, so therefore I'm morally clear, or I'm for DEI initiatives. It's a shortcut to achieving a moral identity. It's a shortcut of evading the protracted process of actually committing moral acts and being committed to sustaining moral acts and sustaining a moral character throughout one's life. It's just a form of virtue signaling that I think is also quite narcissistic. And look at me, I'm guilty. I have ancestral guilt. I bear generational guilt. And now I can somehow do these sort of acts of contrition and get a sort of the equivalent of a papal dispensation from these progressives who will say, or from blacks who will say, well, yeah, you're a good white because you admit to your racism. Not only that, we're going to put you through some anti-racist workshops, and then you're going to self-flagellate further.
Right. And by the way, you're also a good black if
You're
you support reparations. You're not a good black if you don't.
if you don't, exactly. So the collusion between the two groups is just phenomenal. And yeah,
What would you say is the best argument that you've heard for reparations?
The best argument I've heard has to do with the sort of systemic racism that exists in the criminal justice system, because I think we might find some sort of traction. That is, and I'm not talking about the disproportionate number of blacks who are in prison for committing homicides and so on, because there are a disproportionate number of blacks do commit those crimes. But I'm talking about the way in which, for nonviolent crimes, blacks do get an unfair share of what's the word I'm looking for? They do get an unfair share of
Sentencing.
Sentencing, yeah, for using, let's say, crack cocaine versus a white person who uses cocaine.
But it's the laws or the sentencing laws aren't by race. It's just the people who are committing those crimes may be represented disproportionately within race. Yes or no?
Yes, but there is some sort. But I can be sympathetic to the idea that if you are black and you use crack, and if you're white and you use cocaine, you're going to get a different type of sentencing. That there's something punitive that's loosely traceable back to some sort of racial descriptive identity, and that therefore that harms black people from thereafter from building a conception of the good life for themselves. That's the best argument that I've heard, because it's somehow one can sort of ostensibly point to a system of unfairness that should be got rid of. We need to have more equitable laws in that arena.
Jason, we have a segment in each conversation that we call the speed round, and we ask our guests to select from two people or two philosophies and give the reason why they made that choice. So, you both made me feel very lonely when you were celebrating your Jamaican ancestry, but Jason, you brought me back with your love of America, and I felt whole again. But we're going to start with the Honorable Marcus Garvey or W.E.B. Du Bois.
Oh, definitely W. Du Bois. Marcus Garvey was a kook. I mean, this man who thought that. Well, first of all, I don't think there's any comparison. W. Du Bois was a learned scholar. I don't agree necessarily with his philosophy, but I think that his notion of double consciousness, psychologically, he was a lot more insightful. I learned a lot about moral psychology by reading W. E. Du Bois, and the extent to which blacks had to live in two worlds and hold in abeyance their judgments, their talents, their capabilities. I'm going to sound like Robin and DiAngelo now and talk about white fragility, but the way in which blacks really had to sort of traverse and navigate between two worlds, and for the better, were more left with more wisdom. Marcus Garvey, I think, was totally misguided in his idea or notion that blacks could create a life outside of the United States and sort of build some sort of Pan-African existence outside the United States. I mean, he was totally anti-American in his sensibilities. I think he hated America, and was quite misanthropic in his vision towards whites. I don't think W. Du Bois was a racist to begin with. He was the one who said that, he sits there with Balzac and he sits there with Shakespeare, He was a thoroughly Western man with Renaissance polymathic sensibilities. He was a hybrid American who held on to his blackness, but at the same time celebrated the universality of the Western canon and the Western tradition within his personage. I think Marcus Garvey was just a one-dimensional kook.
Very good. Malcolm or Martin?
Oh, definitely Martin, and only because I had the temperament of Malcolm X. Because if I were alive, I would surely be. If I were alive during the '60s, given my temperament, I would be setting fires to people's houses, throwing bottles on the street. I'm just, I'm. But I teach Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and I teach Martin Luther King because I think that the man is a moral giant. The fact that he made friends out of racists. Now, that's not true. I have some of his temperament because I did teach Klan students. But the man is a moral giant. The man is someone who could have used the civil rights movement as a vendetta against white people. He could have used the civil rights movement as a platform to spew, like Louis Farrakhan, who I think is quite horrible, spew invectives against white people. But rather than that, he appealed to the best within whites, the lowest common denominator that existed in the worst races within whites. He never wrote anyone out of history. And he appealed to the best and most exalted heroic sensibilities and moral sensibilities in the most racist of white people. And because of his because I'm also quite religious now, and I'm a Christian, I think he used his Christian sensibilities to see the image of God in even the most racist of white people, and saw that you cannot write anyone out of existence, that the touch of God exists in whites who might be racist but are not beyond redemption. And that is something to be celebrated, because the man could have used his platform to have started a race war in America, and he certainly did not.
My last one is a little bit lighter. Thank you for both your responses. Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan?
I would say Tucker Carlson. And not just because he invited me on his show for about 16 times, but because, I think he's problematic, but he's a thinker, and he's a real intellectual. And he's someone with whom I can disagree and have reasonable disagreements. Joe Rogan, I think, is interesting. He's a comedian. He has an interesting way of facilitating conversations. I've never been on his show, but I don't think he's an intellectual. I don't think he's necessarily a principled thinker. I think Tucker Carlson, because he's so controversial, and because he's such a polarizing figure, but at the same time, because I find that he facilitates real thought and genuine thinking, I would favor him. Because I've interacted with him about 16 times on his show, I sort of have a soft spot for Tucker in a way that I just don't have for Joe Rogan. I don't know him.
Well, hopefully this interview will spur Mr. Rogan to.
Yeah, come on, Joe, get me on your show.
Yes, exactly. Jason, you alluded to, and I wanted to move into, your forthcoming book, Letters to God. You talked a little bit about your faith. Bring us inside that world, because as I understand it, you were an atheist for a period of your life, but something has changed in you. What catalyzed that change, and where are you now?
So in Jamaica, I was quite religious as a child, and around 19 or 20, I became an atheist. And I think, retrospectively, looking back at my life, I think a lot of that had to do with, anger at God for taking away my father, who abandoned his family because of his schizophrenia. At one point, he said, "I can't be your father anymore. I have to repudiate you and your brother, and I'm going off to the mountains." I attributed my atheism to becoming a philosopher and discovering philosophy. So I became an atheist for about 20 years. And after achieving not just a modicum, but quite a lot of academic success, PhD, 2 degrees in undergraduate degrees, a master's, traveling as a young assistant professor, having the privilege of being invited all over Europe, all over the States to give these talks. At one point, I went to Europe 5 times a year as a young assistant professor. I felt this void inside of me. And I had found romantic love. I felt very, very unhappy. I felt this heaviness in my soul, and I realized that atheism was no longer an option. So I started praying to a God I didn't believe in. I said, if you are there, please grant me grace. And this went on, and I went through periods of agnosticism, atheism, temporary belief. And I just knew that atheism was not an option, but need is not belief. The desperate need to believe does not always translate into belief. And in 2019, I was in a church in Michigan, and I went to Good Friday Mass, and I was at Easter Sunday Mass, and I prayed again to God, and I said, "Look, I have a problem with the second divinity, the second part of the Trinity, but I need to be with you, God." And it was as if a force just pushed me into the kneeler, and I felt this force just take over, and I got, was like Saint Augustine, I got zapped, and I said, "Okay, Lord, I give my life to you, and it's yours. Take it." And I surrender my will to yours, and may my will be reconciled with yours. And if I should desire things and they don't happen, may you grant me the grace to realize that your will is superior and vastly superior to my infinitely inferior will, which was something that was so alien to my nature, because not only was I an arrogant, hubristic, egotistical person whose ego was the size of the Titanic, for me to somehow sort of be a supplicant. And I said, I want to be a supplicant to your will, because that's the only way in which I'm going to find peace and happiness in my life, is by surrendering to you. And it's been 4 years now, since 2019, that I had my full conversion, and it's just been amazing. So I had started this book, Letters to God, 24 years ago, as a ritual of undoing the atheism. And I never felt I could publish this book because I never fully gave my life to God. And miraculously, someone heard about me writing this book and said, "Do you have a publisher?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Would you like me to speak to my publisher?" And I said, "Yes," because all my publishers had turned the book down. And no, I could find a publisher for it. About 30 publishers turned it down after I had my conversion experience. And this guy just phoned a publisher for me. He said, "I'll talk to this guy who's a head of a publishing house." And I showed him 30 pages, and he signed me to a contract. And it's been great. I mean, the letters are intimately personal letters to God. Some of them are devotional, some of them are prayers, some of them are asking probing questions about the nature of existence. Some of them are quite philosophical, but most of them are very, very personal letters. I recently did a podcast yesterday, and I've written an article about being molested as a child, which I'd never written or talked about. And I deal with that in the letters, talking about being molested and very, very personal, vulnerable things that happened to me as a child. And it's just an amazing exploration of my relationship with God.
Jason, thank you for the courage in bringing that to bear. What's your hope when people read these letters? What is it that you're hoping, how it will shape their lives?
Well, there's no proselytization going on at all. It's just, I hope that they will realize that if someone such as myself, who was an evangelical atheist, an intransigent, implacable atheist, could have found God and Jesus and become a Christian, that, and whose life has turned around and who's filled with equanimity and serenity. And I've never been happier in my life and never been filled with so much peace, that there really is a God out there who loves you and 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 wants to do good by you. And I hope that, because there's no preaching in there and there's no, thus spake Jason Hill, it's just a sharing of my experiences, that they can also they can find repose and they can find peace and serenity just by reading the book, and tranquility. And my other hope is that people who are sitting on the fence, people who somehow want, to some extent, to approach the Lord but are hesitant, will make what the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard talks about, that leap of faith. You just have to make the leap of faith. You have to embrace a life of faith and reason at the same time, but make that leap of faith and know that God is there, like a benevolent parent who says to his 2-year-old or 3-year-old in the swimming pool, jump, I'll catch you, I won't let you drown. That if you just make that leap of faith, that God is not going to let you drown. He will catch you, He will hold you, and you will be in safe arms.
I think this is such an important message, particularly for young people today in the United States who live, it seems, often in the spiritual void, but don't recognize the power of what a personal faith commitment could mean in their lives.
Yeah. It's a covenant that one also makes with God. I mean, in the letters, I do make it quite clear that I've made a covenant with God that I have no intention of retracting or going back on. And when you make a covenant with God, you don't back out of that covenant. You stick to it. So we're all fallen because we live in a fallen world and we have a fallen nature. And I hope people will realize that just because you have temptations to do the wrong thing and you have temptations to err, that's not a reason not to approach God, that God loves us all despite or even because of our fallen nature, and that we should covenantize with God, and that will strengthen our lives. He will grant us grace. He will love us even more when in our humility and our vulnerability we make the decision to approach Him and give up the arrogance and the hubris to think that we can do this journey by ourselves. There are just a lot of broken people out there who I hope the book will reach and who will find solace in it.
Well, Jason, I feel like we could continue this conversation. There's so many profound messages. Nique, I don't know if you have an additional question, but I did want to ask Jason, and this, we gave you a little bit of background on this podcast, The Invisible Men. Nique and I, 30 years ago, were both on the campus of Harvard Business School, feeling invisible when there was this narrative of Black men being an endangered species, and still feeling that myth, that mythology, still exists today. And one of my biggest concerns is that many young Black boys, in particular, we are invisible. They're not seeing us, and I'd be curious your advice to this imaginary young man that we created, Daryl, who's a 16-year-old Black kid who lives in forgotten USA. And Daryl is trying to figure out, his way in the world. So I'm curious, if you had the opportunity to speak to someone like him, what would you say about faith, about agency, about how he can lead a self-determined life of meaning and purpose?
I would tell Daryl that he should try to, first of all, remember who he was before the world told him who he had to be. That is, there's an authentic Daryl that's there, and that the world is incomplete. The world is totally incomplete before he has suffused it with an original assemblage of who he is. And I would say, Daryl, that's a big term. Let me tell you what I mean. The world is still waiting to be complete with your narrative. Infuse the world with your humanity, because what you have is a strong humanity. You have a story that has to be told. And America is the greatest country that will be the recipient, the repository of that story. And you're America, you're already empowered by living in the greatest country on earth. And so surround yourself with people who validate, affirm your humanity. Remove yourself from the toxicity of negativity, people who detract from you. And remember that this is a country that is receptive to your narrative, to your humanity, be it a smile, be it the practice of good manners, be it the agency that you're cultivating for yourself. Never give up on your country and never give up on yourself. That is, with determination, with grit, with honor. You can infuse the world with your story. And by infusing the world with your story, you continue to make history. You become part of history. And you become very, very powerful.
Yeah. Wow. Dr. Jason Hill, thank you very much. Very, very profound, very powerful. I think we're going to have you on multiple times. Tucker's had you on 16 times. We may have to have you on a few more. I feel like we could continue this conversation, but this is just to whet the appetite.
Thank you
for our audience. So thank you for contributing to a great episode of The Invisible Men. Nique, if you have any reflections on the conversation, but this is quite powerful.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, a very important voice, Jason, a very important voice that I'm so grateful for your passion and commitment to share your views and your philosophies, because they really matter. And your articulation of the brilliance of America is top 5% for me ever. That was really exceptional and meaningful and motivating. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share all of this.
Yep. Thank you, Jason.